The penthouse stretched 40 floors above Manhattan, all glass and cold marble, the kind of silence that money buys when it wants to forget the world exists below. Massimo stood at the window with his phone pressed against his ear, half listening to his attorney discuss offshore accounts while watching traffic crawl through Friday twilight. Then he heard it, faint but cutting through expensive soundproofing, the unmistakable sound of a child crying somewhere inside his carefully controlled fortress. He ended the call without explanation, his attorney's voice disappearing mid-sentence about tax structures that no longer held his attention. The crying wasn't loud, but it carried genuine grief that distinguished real loss from childish tantrum, something broken rather than merely denied. Massimo moved through his penthouse with silent footsteps, tracking the sound with instincts developed in different contexts, when identifying sources of disruption meant survival rather than curiosity. The main living room appeared in his vision, and everything about the scene felt wrong against the backdrop of his minimalist design, where nothing personal ever intruded. Marilyn knelt on his white carpet, still wearing her cleaning uniform, blonde hair falling loose from the bun she always maintained during work. Her arms wrapped around a small girl, whose whole body shook with sobs, yellow pigtails trembling against her mother's shoulder, while pieces of something porcelain scattered across expensive flooring. Massimo stopped in the doorway, suddenly aware that stepping forward meant entering territory where his usual authority provided no useful framework. The child clutched a cloth doll body, while its porcelain head lay separated on the floor, a clean break that had severed painted features from stuffed torso. Marilyn murmured words he couldn't distinguish, her hand moving in circles against her daughter's back with practiced rhythm of someone who'd offered this specific comfort countless times before. The little girl lifted her face from her mother's shoulder, revealing features streaked with tears, and small nose reddened from crying that seemed disproportionate to her size. Her eyes, bright despite the tears, fixed on the broken doll head with an expression that transcended simple disappointment, genuine mourning for something that mattered in ways adults forgot to value. Marilyn noticed his presence then, her body stiffening as she registered her employer watching this vulnerability she'd never intended him to witness. She started to stand, instinctively trying to gather her daughter and the broken pieces, her face flushing with embarrassment that came from years of understanding her place in spaces owned by people like him. Massimo raised one hand, a gesture meant to stop her movement, though he saw her flinch slightly because in her experience, powerful men who raised hands rarely did so for gentle purposes. The child peeked around her mother's dress, tears still clinging to her eyelashes, small fingers gripping the cloth doll body like it contained something precious. Marilyn's voice came out rushed, apologetic, explaining that her usual babysitter had canceled last minute, and she'd thought bringing Isla to work would be fine because the child always stayed quiet during cleaning. The words tumbled over themselves, each one building a defensive wall against expected anger, her free hand already gathering porcelain pieces as if removing evidence quickly enough might erase the transgression. Massimo found himself watching Isla instead of listening to the apologies, noticing how the child's breathing still hitched with residual sobs, even as she tried to stop crying. He crossed the room without deciding to move, his body operating on some instinct that bypassed the careful calculations that normally governed his actions. Kneeling brought him to Isla's eye level, close enough to see that her pigtails were secured with elastic bands that didn't quite match, one pink and one purple, the kind of small imperfection that spoke of morning routines accomplished without luxury of time. The child's crying had reduced to quiet sniffles, but her eyes remained fixed on the broken doll with attachment that made the loss feel monumental. Massimo extended his hand, palm up, waiting rather than demanding, and after a moment's hesitation, Isla placed the porcelain head in his palm with trembling fingers. The doll's painted face stared up at him, blue eyes and rosebud mouth frozen in permanent cheer that contrasted sharply with the tragedy of separation. He examined the break carefully, noting that the fracture line was clean, the kind of damage that looked catastrophic, but might actually allow for repair if someone had the patience to attempt restoration. Marilyn's voice cut through his examination, insisting that they'd replace it somehow, though her tone carried the weight of someone who knew the doll's cost exceeded her weekly salary. She reached for the broken head, trying to extract her daughter and this entire situation from his attention, but Massimo shifted the porcelain piece away from her grasp without looking up. His eyes found Isla's instead, seeing how she watched him with the peculiar intensity of small children who haven't yet learned to hide hope, even when experience suggests disappointment. He asked a question he'd never imagined speaking, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended, wanting to know the doll's name. Isla's answer arrived barely above a whisper, identifying the broken toy as Rosie, pronouncing the name with reverence that elevated the porcelain figure from object to cherished companion. Marilyn had gone completely still beside them, her confusion palpable in the silence that followed this unexpected exchange between her employer and her daughter. Massimo stood, still holding the doll's head, and made a decision that would unravel carefully maintained boundaries he'd spent years constructing around his life. He told Isla he wanted to try fixing Rosie, his words careful because making promises to children wasn't something his experience had prepared him to do correctly. The little girl's eyes widened, tears drying on her cheeks as shock replaced grief, her small mouth forming an O of surprise that she couldn't quite articulate into words. Marilyn found her voice, protesting that he didn't need to do that they couldn't accept such a gesture. Her refusal wrapped in the kind of pride that came from never accepting charity, even when circumstances made it tempting. Massimo ignored her completely, his attention remaining on Isla, waiting for the child's permission rather than the mother's, because instinct told him the doll's fate belonged to its owner. Isla nodded, a tiny movement of her head that carried enormous trust, then carefully handed him the cloth body to go with the severed head. He collected the smaller porcelain fragments from the carpet, his hands that had signed contracts worth millions now gathering pieces of a child's broken toy with unexpected care. Marilyn watched him with an expression that mixed gratitude with deep suspicion, unable to reconcile this action with everything she knew about the man who employed her to clean his space, but never acknowledged her existence. Massimo straightened with all the broken pieces cradled in his palms, aware that he'd just volunteered for a task he had no idea how to accomplish. His study door closed behind him with a soft click, separating him from the living room where Marilyn was probably trying to explain to Isla what had just happened. The room was his private domain, filled with documents and secured files that represented the machinery of his actual business operations, the place where he made decisions that affected territories and income streams most people couldn't imagine. He cleared space on his desk, pushing aside contracts that had seemed urgently important 20 minutes ago, and laid out the pieces of Rosie with the same precision he'd once used to plan territorial expansions. His computer came to life under his fingers, search queries about porcelain repair replacing the financial projections he'd been reviewing, before the crying interrupted his evening. The internet offered multiple solutions, each claiming to be the definitive method for fixing broken ceramics, and Massimo found himself reading restoration forums with the same intensity he usually reserved for market analysis. Tutorial videos played on his screen, demonstrating techniques with brushes and adhesives, their narrators speaking in calm tones about patience and steady hands, and accepting that repaired objects would always show evidence of their breaking. He placed an order for specialized ceramic adhesive with same-day delivery, paying extra for immediate courier service, because waiting until tomorrow felt like breaking an unspoken promise. The supplier's website offered various grades of repair materials, and Massimo selected the professional restoration kit, despite having no idea if the quality difference would matter for a child's toy. His credit card processed the transaction with the same efficiency it handled his usual purchases, though the dollar amount was laughably small compared to his typical expenditures. While waiting for supplies to arrive, Massimo studied the broken pieces, trying to understand how something so fragile had survived long enough to become precious to a child whose life clearly didn't include many possessions. The doll's cloth body showed signs of repeated washing, fabric faded from original brightness, one hand restitched with thread that didn't quite match, evidence of previous repairs done by hands that valued preservation over perfection. A tiny yellow stain marked the dress hem, possibly juice or food, the kind of mark that came from being loved rather than displayed safely on a shelf. The courier arrived within 90 minutes, delivering adhesive and fine brushes and stabilizing tape that the internet had promised would make invisible repairs possible. Massimo signed for the package, without his usual irritation at being interrupted, the young delivery man probably wondering why someone in a penthouse like this needed craft supplies delivered with such urgency. He returned to his study with the box, spreading its contents across his desk like surgical instruments, each item serving a specific purpose in the reconstruction he'd committed himself to attempting. The first tutorial video played again on his screen while he arranged the workspace, and Massimo found himself following instructions narrated by a woman with a British accent who spoke about ceramic repair with the kind of passion usually reserved for fine art. She demonstrated cleaning the edges of broken pieces, removing any dust or oils that might compromise the bond, her hands steady in the close-up shots. Massimo mimicked her movements, using the cotton swabs from the kit to prepare each fragment of Rosie's head with care that surprised him. The adhesive came with warnings about proper ventilation and skin contact, industrial-strength bonding agent that required precision in application. He opened windows despite the November cold, letting Manhattan wind disturb the carefully climate-controlled environment, then squeezed a tiny amount of clear gel onto the mixing palette. The smell was sharp and chemical, completely foreign to his study where expensive leather and old paper usually dominated the sensory landscape. His hands, more accustomed to signing documents than performing delicate manual labor, applied adhesive to porcelain edges with surprising steadiness. Years of control translated into this unexpected application. The same focus he used in negotiations now directed toward aligning painted features with cloth neck. The largest fragment went first, Rosie's face reconnecting with her head in stages, each piece requiring him to hold pressure for 60 seconds while the bond began to set. Massimo discovered that 60 seconds could feel remarkably long when you were trying to keep fractured porcelain perfectly aligned without shifting. His fingers cramped from maintaining exact position, but releasing pressure too soon would mean starting over, so he counted each second and ignored the discomfort. The British woman's voice continued from the computer speaker, explaining that patience was the most important tool in any repair, that rushing the process guaranteed failure no matter how expensive the materials. 3 fragments remained after the face was secured, smaller pieces that had broken from the back of the head where painted hair created decorative detail. These required even more precision because they had to fit into gaps that didn't allow for error, puzzle pieces that only worked in one specific configuration. Massimo used the magnifying glass from the kit, something he'd initially dismissed as unnecessary, and found himself grateful for the enlarged view of hairline cracks and minute edges. The work demanded absolute focus, creating a strange meditation where nothing existed except his hands and the broken doll, and the careful application of adhesive to surfaces that had to align within millimeters. His phone buzzed twice on the desk, calls from associates who expected immediate response, but Massimo ignored the vibrations without even checking who was trying to reach him. Whatever business required his attention could wait, because he'd made a promise to a 3-year-old girl, and breaking that promise felt more consequential than any contract negotiation. 2 hours passed before the last fragment was positioned, the adhesive tube nearly empty from his inexperienced application that had used more than necessary. Rosie's head sat in the stabilizing cradle the kit provided, her features restored but still showing the fracture lines like scars across porcelain skin. The British woman had warned that repairs would always be visible, that perfection was impossible, but Massimo found himself studying those lines with something close to satisfaction rather than disappointment. The kit included fine grit sandpaper for smoothing rough edges once the adhesive fully cured, but that process required 24 hours of undisturbed setting time. Massimo consulted the instruction manual, then made a decision that deviated from recommended procedure, carefully moving the stabilizing cradle to a shelf where it could rest without being disturbed. His desk looked strange without the broken pieces scattered across it, the protective cloth now empty except for adhesive residue and cotton swab debris. He returned to the living room expecting to find it empty, assuming Marilyn had finished her work and taken Isla home once the drama subsided. Instead, he found the space transformed into something that resembled actual habitation rather than showroom perfection, evidence of a child's presence scattered in ways his housekeeper would never have allowed under normal circumstances. Crayons lay on his coffee table beside paper covered in drawings, bold colors depicting houses and stick figures and what might have been flowers or possibly explosions, the artistic ambiguity of very young children. Marilyn appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs, her movements careful and apologetic, clearly trying to minimize her intrusion while explaining that Isla had fallen asleep on his couch. The child was indeed curled on the white leather, her yellow pigtails spread across a cushion, one small hand tucked under her cheek in that boneless sleep that only children seemed capable of achieving. Massimo had never seen anyone sleep on his furniture, had never imagined his sterile living room serving as someone's resting place. Marilyn started to wake her daughter, whispering that they needed to go home now, that she'd finished all the cleaning and they'd overstayed already. Massimo heard himself say, "Wait," the single word stopping her movement, and he wasn't entirely sure what he was asking her to wait for. His eyes went to the drawings on the table, one depicting what was clearly meant to be Rosie, the doll rendered in blue crayon with yellow hair, and a smile that took up most of her circular face. He asked if Isla had drawn these while waiting, a question with an obvious answer, but Marilyn nodded anyway, and explained that her daughter loved to draw. that keeping her supplied with paper and crayons was easier than toys they couldn't afford. The comment wasn't said with self-pity, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement of economic reality, the kind of statement people made when they'd long since stopped being surprised by their own limitations. Massimo picked up the drawing of Rosie, studying the careful way Isla had added details like the doll's dress buttons and the bow in her hair. Something shifted in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that he couldn't quite name, watching this small person sleep so trustingly in his space, while her mother stood ready to apologize for existing. His penthouse had never contained this kind of vulnerability, this evidence of lives lived without the protective barriers money built around people who could afford them. The drawings on his table, the sleeping child on his couch, the woman holding mugs of tea she'd made in his kitchen, all of it represented an intrusion that should have triggered his usual need for controlled isolation. Instead, Massimo found himself asking Marilyn if she wanted to sit down, gesturing toward the chair across from where Ayla slept, aware that he'd never offered his housekeeper a seat in the 2 years she'd been working for him. She hesitated, clearly uncertain about accepting, her eyes moving between him and her daughter as if calculating the social mathematics of this unprecedented situation. The mugs in her hand steamed slightly, the scent of chamomile tea drifting across space that usually smelled of nothing but expensive air filtration. She sat finally, perching on the edge of the chair like someone ready to flee at the first sign of dismissal, and placed one mug on the table while keeping the other cradled in her hands for warmth. Massimo remained standing, suddenly aware that he had no script for this interaction, no framework for talking to his housekeeper as anything other than someone who cleaned his space and received payment bi-weekly through automatic bank transfer. The silence stretched between them, not quite uncomfortable, but weighted with all the things that normally remained unspoken between people, separated by wealth and circumstance. He heard himself asking about Isla's father, a question that crossed boundaries he'd never previously acknowledged, but Marilyn's expression didn't register surprise or offense. She answered simply that he'd died 2 years ago, a construction accident that had left her with a toddler and debt from medical bills that had accumulated before the end came. Her voice remained steady while delivering information that represented catastrophic loss. The kind of emotional control that came from having to keep functioning when falling apart wasn't an option. Massimo processed this information, connecting it to details he'd never bothered noticing before. The tired shadows under Marilyn's eyes that spoke of sleep sacrificed to second jobs. The worn quality of her shoes that suggested replacements ranked low on priority lists. She worked for him 3 times a week, which meant she worked for others on the remaining days, assembling an income from fragments the way he'd just assembled Rosie's head from broken pieces. The comparison felt both apt and inadequate, because his repair project would be finished in 24 hours, while her reconstruction of life after loss might never feel complete. The chamomile tea cooled in the mug Marilyn held, her fingers wrapped around ceramic warmth while she watched her daughter sleep with the kind of vigilance that never fully relaxed. Massimo found himself sitting finally, taking the chair beside hers rather than across from it, a position that felt less like interrogation and more like the conversation that seemed to be happening, despite both of them being surprised by it. He told her that Rosie was being repaired in his study, that the doll would need to cure overnight but should be ready by tomorrow afternoon. Marilyn's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for him to identify individually, landing somewhere between gratitude and confusion, and something that might have been suspicion about motives. She thanked him with careful formality, adding that it wasn't necessary, that Isla would have eventually forgotten about the doll the way children forget most things that seem devastating in the moment. Massimo found himself disagreeing before he'd consciously decided to engage the statement, saying that some things shouldn't be forgotten, that objects that mattered deserved repair rather than replacement. The words came out carrying more weight than he'd intended, revealing something about his own philosophy that he hadn't articulated before this moment. Marilyn studied him with eyes that had learned to read people as a survival skill, trying to reconcile this man who fixed children's toys with the employer who'd never acknowledged her existence beyond signed paychecks. Her daughter shifted in sleep, making small sounds that mothers interpreted through years of practice but didn't wake. Massimo found himself talking about his own childhood, words emerging without permission from whatever compartment he'd locked those memories into decades ago. He described growing up in a neighborhood where broken things stayed broken because repair required resources that didn't exist, where his mother had worked 3 jobs the way Marilyn probably did now. The comparison felt presumptuous, but he continued anyway, explaining that he'd once had a toy fire truck, red plastic with wheels that actually turned, the most valuable thing he'd owned at age 5. The fire truck had broken when another kid had thrown it against pavement, during an argument Massimo couldn't remember the cause of anymore, and his mother had promised to fix it, but never had, because fixing required time and money that were always allocated to more urgent necessities. He'd kept the broken pieces for years, carrying them from apartment to apartment, through moves necessitated by evictions and rent increases, finally throwing them away when he was 15, and had decided that sentiment was weakness. His voice remained steady while delivering this information, but something in his chest felt tight, in ways that had nothing to do with physical discomfort. Marilyn listened without interrupting, her tea forgotten as she focused on this unexpected glimpse into history that explained nothing and everything simultaneously. When he finished talking, she said quietly that she was sorry, 2 words that carried genuine sympathy for a loss most people would dismiss as trivial. Massimo felt something shift at her response, the acknowledgement that childhood wounds could matter even when they involved broken toys rather than broken bones. He asked about Rosie's significance to Isla, whether the doll had particular history that made it more than just another toy. Marilyn's expression softened in the way faces do when accessing precious memories, and she explained that Rosie had been a gift from Isla's father 3 days before the accident that had killed him. He'd bought it with overtime pay, spending more than they could afford on something impractical and beautiful, joking that their daughter deserved at least one thing that wasn't second-hand or sensible. The doll had become Isla's connection to a father she was too young to remember clearly, the physical object that represented abstract loss she couldn't fully comprehend yet. Marilyn admitted that she'd been terrified when the head broke, not because of the financial cost, but because she couldn't bear to see her daughter lose this piece of her father too. Her voice wavered slightly on the last words, the first crack in her careful composure, and she looked away quickly as if ashamed of the emotion. Massimo understood then why he'd felt compelled to attempt the repair, why walking away from broken porcelain on his carpet had felt impossible. This wasn't about a toy. It was about preserving connection across the distance death created, about refusing to accept that everything precious was doomed to eventual loss. His own father had disappeared when he was 7, not through death, but through choice, leaving debts and chaos and a family that struggled to survive his absence. There was no object that connected Massimo to that man, no physical anchor for memories that were mostly anger and confusion and relief that abuse had finally ended. He told Marilyn that the repair would show, that the fracture lines would remain visible even after the adhesive cured completely, and he needed her to prepare Isla for that reality. Perfect restoration wasn't possible, but the doll would be whole again, functional despite the scars that marked where it had broken. Marilyn nodded understanding, saying that visible mending was still better than permanent loss, that maybe there was value in seeing where things had broken and been put back together. The philosophy in her words struck Massimo as profound, despite, or perhaps because of, its simplicity. He looked at Isla sleeping on his couch, this small person who carried grief she couldn't fully articulate, who would wake up to find her precious doll being restored by a stranger with resources, but no idea how to connect with children. The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it weren't so genuine, if he couldn't feel something in himself responding to this vulnerability in ways that terrified him. Marilyn checked her phone, her expression tightening as she registered the time approaching 8 o'clock, much later than she'd planned to stay. She started to rise, preparing to wake Isla and gather their things, her movements quick with the efficiency of someone accustomed to not wasting minutes. Massimo heard himself offering to drive them home, the words surprising both of them, his car and driver waiting in the garage specifically for purposes like this, even though he'd never used them for anything resembling charity. She refused immediately, instinct and pride combining to reject the offer before she'd consciously considered it, already explaining about the subway and how it wasn't far. Massimo persisted with uncharacteristic insistence, pointing out that Isla was exhausted and carrying a sleeping child through Manhattan at night wasn't safe regardless of how many times she'd done it successfully before. The argument was paternalistic and presumptuous, and he saw Marilyn recognize this even as she wavered between refusing again and accepting help she clearly needed. Eventually, she agreed with visible reluctance, adding that he didn't need to come with them, that the driver alone would be sufficient. Massimo ignored this addendum, already moving toward the door and calling down to the garage to have his car brought around, making decisions that overrode her preferences in ways that probably mirrored every wealthy employer she'd ever encountered. He recognized the dynamic even as he perpetuated it, the automatic assumption that his solutions were better because they came with resources she lacked. Marilyn woke Isla gently, her voice soft as she explained they were going home now, that a nice man was going to drive them. The child stirred slowly, her eyes opening with the confused disorientation of someone pulled from deep sleep, and her first words were asking about Rosie. Marilyn assured her that the doll was being fixed, that they'd see her tomorrow, and Isla's face brightened even through her sleepiness, the promise of restoration enough to make leaving acceptable. The elevator ride down 40 floors happened in silence, broken only by Isla's small yawns and the mechanical hum of descent. Massimo's driver waited with the car, his expression carefully neutral at this unprecedented use of the vehicle for transporting his employer's housekeeper and her child. The back seat was leather and spacious, designed for business meetings and airport transfers, now serving as transportation for a woman in a cleaning uniform and a 3-year-old in cartoon pajamas. Marilyn gave an address in Queens, a neighborhood Massimo knew primarily as a place his car passed through on the way to other destinations, and they pulled into Manhattan traffic that was Friday night thick with people heading toward entertainment he never participated in. Isla sat between them, her small body swaying slightly with the car's movement, fighting sleep, because the novelty of this experience demanded attention. She asked in a small voice if Massimo was the one fixing Rosie, her eyes wide with the kind of trust that assumed adults told the truth when they made promises. He confirmed that he was, watching her process this information with visible concentration, her small face serious in a way that children's faces became when they were trying to understand adult complexities. Isla announced that he must be very good at fixing things, the statement delivered with absolute certainty, despite having no evidence beyond his claim that repair was possible. Massimo felt something tighten in his chest again, this child's faith in his ability more weighted than any business partner's trust in his negotiation skills. The address Marilyn had given led to a building that looked tired, in the way structures become when maintenance is deferred year after year for lack of funds. Massimo's driver pulled to the curb outside a 5-story walk-up with fire escapes creating geometric shadows across brick facade, the kind of place he'd lived in as a child before money had insulated him from such realities. Windows glowed with warm light from apartments stacked vertically, each one containing lives he never thought about when moving through the city in vehicles with tinted glass. Marilyn gathered Isla quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the car idling in front of her building where neighbors might see and draw conclusions. She thanked him with careful formality, already opening the door before the driver could assist her. Massimo found himself exiting the vehicle as well, ignoring her surprised expression, following them toward the building entrance with no clear purpose beyond delaying the moment when they'd disappear into their separate reality. The building's front door required a key, the lock mechanism old enough that it stuck slightly before yielding to Marilyn's practiced twist. The lobby was small and showed signs of resident effort to maintain dignity despite limited resources, someone's attempt at decorating visible in the plastic plant near the mailboxes. Stairs led upward into dimness that suggested burned-out bulbs in the upper landings, the kind of detail landlords ignored when dealing with tenants who couldn't afford to move. Isla had woken more fully during the car ride, and now she looked between her mother and Massimo with obvious confusion about why he was following them inside. Marilyn hesitated at the base of the stairs, her discomfort visible as she tried to find polite words to dismiss him, to establish the boundary his presence had violated. Before she could speak, Isla asked if he wanted to see her drawings, the question delivered with the guileless hospitality of children who hadn't learned social hierarchies yet. Massimo heard himself accepting before considering the implications, watching Marilyn's expression shift from discomfort to resignation, as she understood that refusing now would require explaining adult complexities to her daughter. She started up the stairs without further comment, Isla's hand in hers, and Massimo followed them upward through the narrow stairwell that smelled of cooking from multiple apartments. Each landing revealed doors painted in colors that had faded to similarity, numbers marked in brass that had tarnished to dull brown. Their apartment was on the 4th floor, and Marilyn's breathing had quickened slightly by the time she unlocked the door, evidence of someone who climbed these stairs multiple times daily while carrying groceries and laundry and a small child. The door opened into a space so different from his penthouse that it might have existed in a separate dimension, tiny rooms made smaller by the furniture necessary for living. Everything was clean despite obvious age, surfaces that had been scrubbed to compensate for wear they couldn't afford to replace. The main room served as living area and kitchen combined, separated only by a counter that divided cooking space from a couch positioned against one wall. Isla's drawings covered the refrigerator, held by magnets shaped like fruit, a gallery of crayon artwork that documented her perspective on the world. The apartment was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, the kind of warmth that came from intention rather than expensive heating systems. Marilyn moved through the space with quick efficiency, turning on lamps and gathering toys scattered on the floor, her movements revealing embarrassment about him seeing how they lived. Massimo remained near the door, suddenly aware that his presence represented an intrusion that went beyond mere physical space into the private reality she'd constructed for her daughter. His Italian shoes on her worn carpet felt like a statement about disparities he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Isla had no such hesitation, pulling him by the hand toward a small table where more drawings lay stacked beside a coffee can, holding crayons in various states of wear. She showed him her artwork with pride, explaining each picture's subject matter with the detailed conviction of someone who knew exactly what she'd intended to create. The stick figures were her and Marilyn. The yellow circle was the sun. The brown rectangle was their building, each element labeled in her narration with complete certainty. One drawing showed 3 figures instead of 2, and when Massimo asked about it, Isla explained that the third person was her daddy who lived in the sky now. She pointed to blue crayon above the figures, indicating heaven with the literal interpretation children used for abstract concepts. Marilyn's voice came from the kitchen area, tight as she offered tea he didn't want, trying to fill silence with hospitality that cost her something to provide. He declined the tea gently, explaining that he needed to return home, but found himself asking Isla if she liked to draw. The question was obvious given the evidence surrounding them, but she answered with enthusiasm, nodding so hard her pigtails bounced, explaining that drawing was her favorite thing, because you could make anything you wanted if you had the right colors. Her philosophy was simple, but contained truth about creation and control that resonated despite coming from someone who could barely hold crayons correctly. Massimo heard himself asking if she'd like more supplies, the offer emerging before he'd consciously decided to make it, and immediately saw Marilyn stiffen across the room. She started to refuse on Isla's behalf, pride overriding her daughter's excitement, but Isla's face had already transformed with joy at the possibility of new crayons. The conflict between protecting dignity and accepting help played across Marilyn's features, maternal desire to give her child things warring with determination to not become a charity case. He clarified that it wasn't charity, that he'd appreciate having Isla draw something for him to put in his office, payment for services rendered. The lie was transparent, but gave Marilyn framework to accept without compromising her principles, and after a moment she agreed with visible reluctance. Isla immediately announced she would draw him the best picture ever, something with all the colors, her small face serious with the weight of this commission. The conversation had created intimacy that made leaving feel abrupt, but Massimo moved toward the door anyway, aware that prolonging his visit would only increase the strangeness of this entire situation. Marilyn walked him out, her posture formal again as they crossed the threshold back into the hallway where their respective roles could be more clearly defined. She thanked him once more for fixing Rosie, for driving them home, for not being angry about Isla's presence in his penthouse, each gratitude stacking on the others until they felt almost accusatory. He told her to bring Isla with her next time she came to clean, the words surprising both of them with the implication that this would become regular, rather than emergency exception. Marilyn studied his face, trying to read motives behind the offer, clearly suspecting complications that would emerge from blurring boundaries between employer and employee. Before she could refuse, he added that his penthouse could use some life, that seeing it through a child's eyes might be good for both the space and himself. The admission was more honest than he'd intended, revealing loneliness he'd convinced himself didn't exist in his carefully constructed isolation. Marilyn's expression softened slightly, recognition passing through her eyes that suggested she understood something about him that he'd been hiding from himself. She agreed finally, with the caveat that Isla would need to behave, that any disruption would mean returning to the previous arrangement of leaving her daughter with sitters. Massimo descended the 4 flights of stairs back to his waiting car, aware that something had shifted in ways he couldn't quite define or control. His driver opened the door without comment, but Massimo caught the slight raise of eyebrows that suggested surprise at this unprecedented detour. The drive back to his penthouse took 20 minutes through traffic, but his mind remained in that small apartment with its warmth and drawings and evidence of life, lived without the protective barriers money built. His penthouse felt even more sterile when he returned, the silence he'd once valued now seeming oppressive rather than peaceful. Massimo walked to his study where Rosie's head still sat in the stabilizing cradle, the fracture lines visible, but the doll unmistakably whole again despite her scars. He thought about Marilyn's words, that visible mending was better than permanent loss, that there might be value in seeing where things had broken and been put back together. Saturday morning arrived with weak November sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Massimo woke earlier than necessary with thoughts of the previous evening, refusing to settle into the compartments where he usually stored experiences. His coffee maker produced the same expensive blend it always did, but he found himself drinking it standing at the window, looking down at the city, and wondering which of those distant buildings contained Marilyn and Isla's fourth-floor apartment. The thought felt invasive even in its vagueness, crossing boundaries he'd never questioned before encountering a child crying over a broken doll. He spent the morning checking on Rosie's repair with frequency that bordered on obsessive, examining the fracture lines and testing the stability of the bond. The adhesive had cured properly according to the instructions, creating a connection that would hold under normal use, though the doll would never survive another drop. Massimo found sandpaper in the kit and smoothed the rough edges where excess adhesive had squeezed from the joints, his movements careful despite having no audience to judge the quality of his work. The stabilizing cradle came away cleanly, leaving Rosie sitting upright on his desk, her painted face restored, even if the lines crossing her features told the story of her breaking. He attached the head back to the cloth body, the connection requiring no more than alignment, since the original attachment mechanism still functioned. The doll looked simultaneously perfect and damaged, whole, but marked by experience in ways that changed her character without destroying her fundamental identity. Massimo placed Rosie carefully in a box lined with tissue paper, creating protection for the journey back to her owner, aware that he was treating a child's toy with the same attention he'd give to important documents. His phone showed several missed calls from business associates whose problems he'd been ignoring since yesterday evening, but returning those calls felt less urgent than ensuring Rosie reached Isla safely. The recognition that he'd rearranged his priorities around a 3-year-old's happiness should have disturbed him more than it did. Monday came eventually despite the weekend's strange suspension of normal patterns, and Massimo found himself watching for Marilyn's arrival with anticipation he refused to examine. She appeared precisely at 9 as scheduled, Isla's hand clasped in hers, both of them seeming uncertain about this new arrangement where the child would be present. Isla wore overalls and a yellow shirt, her pigtails secured with matching purple bands this time, small backpack on her shoulders that probably contained the entertainment necessary to keep a 3-year-old occupied during her mother's work hours. Massimo met them in the entryway, Rosie's box in his hands, and watched Isla's face transform when she understood what he was holding. The child's squeal of excitement was the first truly loud sound his penthouse had probably ever contained, her small body bouncing with joy that seemed too large for her physical form. Marilyn started to quiet her automatically, maternal instinct to control volume in spaces that belonged to other people, but Massimo shook his head to indicate it didn't matter. Isla opened the box with trembling fingers, her breath catching when she saw Rosie whole again, despite the visible lines crossing her porcelain face. She lifted the doll carefully, cradling it against her chest with the kind of fierce tenderness that comes from understanding fragility through experience. Her eyes found the fracture lines immediately, small fingers tracing them gently, and instead of disappointment at the imperfect repair, her expression showed something closer to wonder at the restoration. She announced that Rosie had scars now, just like real people, her tone carrying approval rather than criticism, the perspective of someone who'd learned early that perfection wasn't a requirement for love. Marilyn's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly, her hand covering her mouth briefly before she composed herself with visible effort. Massimo found himself looking away from her emotion, uncomfortable with the intimacy of witnessing her vulnerability, focusing instead on Isla's continued examination of her repaired doll. The child looked up at him with an expression of such pure gratitude that it hit harder than any business success he'd ever achieved, and she said thank you in a small voice that carried weight beyond its volume. Then, without warning or permission, Isla crossed the distance between them and wrapped her small arms around his legs in a hug that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but seemed to rearrange something fundamental in his chest. Massimo's hands hovered uncertainly in the air, having no reference for how to respond to unsolicited affection from a child. Marilyn apologized immediately, pulling Isla back gently and explaining that they didn't hug people without asking, that she was sorry for the boundary violation. Massimo heard himself saying it was fine, that no apology was necessary, surprised to realize he meant it despite his usual aversion to physical contact. The hug had felt foreign, but not unwelcome, a reminder that human connection could be simple, rather than the complicated negotiations that characterized his adult relationships. Isla settled on the living room floor with Rosie and her crayons, while Marilyn began her cleaning routine, and Massimo found excuses to work from his living room laptop, rather than retreating to his study. He pretended to review contracts, but his attention kept drifting to the small person creating artwork nearby. Her conversation with Rosie conducted in whispers that assumed the doll could hear and respond. The one-sided dialogue revealed Isla's interior world, her explanations about why they were in the fancy apartment, and how the nice man had fixed Rosie's broken head. At one point, Isla approached his position on the couch, drawing in hand, and asked if he wanted to see what she'd made. The picture showed two figures, one tall and one small, with a doll between them that had lines across its face, representing the repaired cracks. She explained that it was him and her and Rosie, her artistic interpretation of the repair that had created connection between them. Massimo accepted the drawing with care, asking if he could keep it, watching her face light up with pride that her work was valued. He found a frame later that day, expensive glass and metal designed to showcase important documents, and placed Isla's crayon drawing inside with the same ceremony he'd used for contracts worth millions. The framed artwork went on his desk in his study, visible whenever he sat down to work, a reminder of something he couldn't quite articulate but felt increasingly necessary to preserve. His business associates would have found the gesture incomprehensible, this evidence of sentiment from someone known for emotional detachment. The week developed a rhythm where Isla's presence became expected rather than exceptional, her small voice and periodic questions creating soundtrack to Marilyn's cleaning work. Massimo discovered that children asked questions without the political calculation adults employed. Isla's inquiries about why he lived alone or whether he had family emerging from genuine curiosity rather than strategic information gathering. Her directness was refreshing, even when it touched on subjects he'd spent years avoiding through sophisticated deflection. He started keeping snacks that children might like, consulting internet searches about appropriate foods for 3-year-olds, his kitchen slowly accumulating crackers and fruit pouches alongside his usual Spartan provisions. The domestic transformation felt absurd when he noticed it consciously, this gradual accommodation of needs that weren't his own. But Isla's delight when he offered apple slices made the absurdity feel worthwhile. Marilyn watched these small gestures with expressions that mixed gratitude and concern, clearly trying to understand his motives while protecting her daughter from potential disappointment. Friday afternoon arrived with Isla showing him her collection of completed drawings, each one depicting scenes from her week with varying accuracy to actual events. One showed him at his desk with exaggerated frown lines. Another showed her mother cleaning while musical notes floated around suggesting Marilyn sang while working. The artistic documentation of their time together felt significant in ways he couldn't articulate, evidence that his isolated existence had been penetrated by people who saw him as more than business function. Marilyn finished her work and began gathering their belongings, the familiar end-of-day routine, but Isla asked in a small voice if they could stay longer this time. The request was directed at her mother, but Isla's eyes moved to Massimo as if seeking support, her expression hopeful, despite clearly expecting refusal. Marilyn started to explain that they couldn't impose, that his time was valuable, all the reasonable adult justifications for maintaining boundaries that had already become blurred beyond recognition. Massimo heard himself suggesting they stay for dinner, the invitation emerging before he'd consciously formulated it, surprising all three of them with its spontaneity. His penthouse had never hosted dinner guests. His meals usually consumed alone, or at business functions that had nothing to do with actual human connection. Marilyn's refusal was immediate and reflexive, pride asserting itself against charity that kept manifesting despite her resistance, but Isla's excitement made retreating difficult. The dinner happened despite Marilyn's reservations, though calling it dinner was perhaps generous given that Massimo's kitchen contained nothing resembling family meal ingredients. He ordered from a restaurant that normally catered his business functions, explaining the situation to a confused manager who'd never received a request for child-friendly options. The food arrived in containers too elegant for the casual meal he'd envisioned, but Isla didn't seem to notice the presentation incongruity. Her attention focused entirely on the pasta that came with butter sauce simple enough for young palates. They ate at his dining table, a surface he'd used perhaps 3 times in 5 years, and the conversation flowed with surprising ease considering the strangeness of the gathering. Isla filled silences with observations about her day, her narration jumping between topics without logical connection, the stream of consciousness style that came naturally to children. Marilyn gradually relaxed her defensive posture, her shoulders losing some of their perpetual tension, though her eyes still tracked Isla's manners with maternal vigilance designed to prevent embarrassment. Massimo found himself asking about their weekends, about routines and small rituals that made up their lives outside his penthouse, questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite conversation. Marilyn described Saturday mornings at the library where Isla could access books they couldn't afford to buy, the park near their apartment where playground equipment was old but functional. Her description painted a picture of life lived intentionally despite limitations, maximizing joy from free resources while working multiple jobs to cover necessities. The contrast to his own weekends, typically filled with work he brought home or business dinners that required attendance, felt stark enough to create discomfort he couldn't quite dismiss. Isla asked what he did for fun, the question direct in the way children's questions were, and Massimo realized he had no genuine answer. His recreational time, such as it existed, consisted of activities designed to maintain business relationships or physical fitness, nothing that qualified as fun in the sense Isla meant it. He admitted as much, watching Isla's face scrunch with confusion that an adult might not have fun, her worldview not yet including the concept that people might choose work over play. She announced with complete confidence that he should come to the park with them, that swings were fun, and he could try them. Her solution to his deficit delivered with the certainty that all problems had simple fixes. Marilyn intervened gently, explaining that he was probably too busy, providing the adult excuse that protected against disappointment when invitations weren't accepted. Massimo surprised himself by agreeing to visit the park, setting a time for Sunday afternoon. Watching Marilyn's expression shift from shock to concern as she tried to understand what game he was playing. He wasn't entirely sure himself, his motivations unclear even to his own analysis. But the idea of spending time at a playground felt both absurd and necessary in ways he couldn't articulate. Isla's resulting excitement justified the commitment regardless of his confusion about underlying reasons. The evening ended with Massimo's driver taking them home again, the arrangement having become routine enough that Marilyn no longer protested, despite her obvious discomfort with the luxury. Isla fell asleep during the drive, her small body pressed against her mother's side, Rosie clutched in her arms with the fierce possession that comes from knowing things can be lost. Massimo watched them from his corner of the back seat, mother and child creating unit of two, that functioned with synchronization developed through years of being only each other's certainty. Sunday arrived with weather that threatened rain, but hadn't committed to it yet. November cold that suggested winter was approaching, despite autumn's technical continuation. Massimo dressed in jeans and a sweater, clothing from the back of his closet that he'd purchased for occasions that never materialized, feeling strange in casual wear that stripped away the armor of expensive suits. His driver seemed equally confused by the destination, a public park in Queens, rather than the usual rotation of office buildings and high-end restaurants. The park was smaller than Massimo had envisioned, playground equipment showing signs of heavy use and deferred maintenance, but children filled the space with energy that transcended the setting's limitations. He spotted Marilyn and Isla near the swings, both of them bundled in coats that had seen multiple winters, waiting with the punctuality of people who'd learned that other people's time mattered more when you had less of it. Isla's face transformed when she saw him approach, her excitement visible in the way she bounced on her toes. She pulled him immediately toward the swings, insisting that he had to try them, that flying was the best feeling, and he'd been missing it his whole life. Marilyn watched with an expression mixing amusement and disbelief as Massimo lowered himself onto a swing designed for children, the metal chains creaking under his adult weight. Isla demanded he pump his legs to go higher, demonstrating the technique with her own swinging, and Massimo found himself following her instructions despite feeling ridiculous. The absurdity of the situation struck him fully as he sat on a children's swing in a public park, following the earnest directions of a 3-year-old who believed he'd been deprived of essential life experience. But something in the motion, the brief suspension at the height of each arc, created a sensation he couldn't remember feeling in decades, a moment of weightlessness that had nothing to do with business calculations or strategic planning. Isla's laughter at his participation carried pure delight without judgment, and Marilyn's smile suggested she was seeing something that surprised her. After swings came the slide, then the climbing structure that Isla insisted he navigate, despite his size making the equipment comically inappropriate. Other parents watched with expressions ranging from confusion to amusement, trying to understand why a man in expensive casual wear was crawling through playground tunnels at a child's insistence. Massimo ignored their attention, discovering that Isla's approval mattered more than strangers' opinions, a priority shift that would have been unthinkable months ago. They bought hot chocolate from a vendor near the park entrance. Isla served with marshmallows that she distributed between herself and Rosie, explaining that dolls got cold too. Massimo sat on a bench between Marilyn and Isla, drinking overpriced chocolate that tasted nothing like the gourmet versions his usual establishment served. But somehow the setting made it better. The conversation drifted between topics without agenda, Marilyn sharing stories from her week at other jobs, while Isla interjected with her own observations about the world. Something shifted during that afternoon, a subtle recalibration of how Massimo understood his own life and what he'd been missing in his pursuit of isolation, masquerading as success. Isla's unselfconscious joy, Marilyn's careful warmth that was beginning to include him in its radius, the simple pleasure of hot chocolate in cold weather, all of it created an experience that made his penthouse feel empty in retrospect. The recognition carried danger he could feel approaching but couldn't quite name yet. The park visit ended as light began failing, Isla's energy finally depleting to the point where she leaned heavily against her mother. Massimo offered to drive them home, the routine now established enough to not require discussion, and they accepted without the protest that had marked earlier offers. The drive back to Queens happened in comfortable silence, Isla dozing against Marilyn's shoulder while the city rolled past outside tinted windows. At their building, Marilyn thanked him with less formality than previous occasions, her gratitude carrying warmth that suggested the boundaries between employer and something else had blurred beyond clear definition. Isla woke enough to hug his legs again before heading inside, and this time Massimo's hand touched her shoulder briefly in acknowledgement, physical contact that felt less foreign than the first time. He watched them disappear into their building, yellow pigtails visible until the door closed behind them. His driver navigated back toward Manhattan, while Massimo processed the afternoon's events, aware that something fundamental had shifted in how he moved through the world. The penthouse awaited with its silence and space, and carefully controlled environment, luxury that suddenly felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. His phone showed multiple messages from business associates, problems that required attention, but addressing them felt less urgent than preserving whatever had emerged from this unexpected entanglement with a housekeeper and her daughter. Monday morning arrived with Massimo making a decision that would fracture the fragile connection he'd been building, though he wouldn't understand the full implications until much later. His attorney called regarding a business opportunity in Singapore, a project requiring his presence for at least 2 weeks, possibly extending to a month, depending on negotiation complexity. The timing was impossible to refuse, the financial stakes too high to delegate, but accepting meant disappearing from the routine that Isla and Marilyn had integrated into. He told his attorney to confirm the Singapore arrangements, blocking out the awareness that this decision represented exactly the kind of choice that had kept him isolated for years, prioritizing business over connection. The rational justifications lined up perfectly, the financial necessity beyond question, but underneath the logic was fear that he'd let these two people become too important too quickly. Distance would allow him to reassess, to determine whether this entire situation was sustainable or just emotional indulgence he couldn't afford. The decision to leave without explanation felt safer than confronting what goodbye might reveal. The potential emotion in Isla's face or questions in Marilyn's eyes, threatening to expose vulnerabilities he'd spent the weekend recognizing, but wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. Massimo told himself that maintaining professional boundaries was appropriate given their actual relationship, that his housekeeper didn't require notification of his travel schedule beyond what affected her employment. The justification was technically accurate but emotionally dishonest. A retreat into formality that protected him from having to admit that saying goodbye to a 3-year-old and her mother had become something that mattered enough to hurt. He scheduled his departure for early Wednesday specifically to avoid their Friday cleaning appointment, the cowardice of his timing obvious even to himself, but not sufficient to change the plan. Massimo left for Singapore on a Wednesday morning without saying goodbye to Marilyn or Isla, convincing himself that their next scheduled cleaning day would pass without incident. He sent a brief email through his assistant explaining that he'd be traveling for business, that his housekeeper should continue her usual schedule in his absence, the communication deliberately impersonal to re-establish boundaries he'd allowed to dissolve. The flight across the Pacific gave him 13 hours to construct rational justifications for the distance he was creating, though none of them quite masked the underlying fear that had motivated the decision. Singapore greeted him with humidity and business meetings that consumed 16-hour days, the kind of schedule he'd once thrived on because it left no space for introspection. The project involved territorial negotiations with partners who operated in legal gray areas, the type of dealings that required his specific expertise in navigating complexity without visible illegality. His hotel suite overlooked Marina Bay, glass and steel and curated luxury that reminded him of his penthouse, spaces designed to insulate wealth from anything resembling genuine human need. The first week passed in a blur of conference rooms and working dinners, his mind occupied with contract language and liability structures that felt comfortably familiar after the disorienting intimacy of recent weeks. He didn't think about Marilyn arriving at his penthouse on Friday to find it empty, didn't imagine Isla asking where he'd gone or why he hadn't said goodbye. The deliberate not thinking required more energy than acknowledging the thoughts would have taken. But Massimo had years of practice in compartmentalizing what he didn't want to confront. His assistant called during the second week with routine updates about his New York operations, and Massimo found himself asking whether his housekeeper had continued her schedule. The question emerged before he could stop it, revealing the preoccupation he'd been trying to suppress, and his assistant confirmed that Marilyn was maintaining her usual days. The information should have been sufficient, but Massimo heard himself asking if she'd brought her daughter, needing to know if Isla was still coming despite his absence. The assistant's confused pause suggested the question crossed professional boundaries, but she confirmed that a child had been present during the cleaning visits. Massimo ended the call feeling both relieved and guilty, the confirmation that they were continuing routines in his absence, somehow making his departure feel more like abandonment than business necessity. He tried to focus on the contract negotiations that required his attention, but his concentration had fractured in ways that usually didn't happen during important deals. Singapore's nightlife offered distractions he'd normally have ignored, but Massimo found himself accepting invitations to clubs and bars from business associates who mistook his isolation for availability. The attempts at distraction failed comprehensively, alcohol and loud music only emphasizing the emptiness he was trying to escape rather than filling it. He left early from every outing, returning to his hotel suite to stare at his phone and resist the urge to call his own penthouse just to hear if anyone answered. The third week brought a breakthrough in negotiations that should have felt like victory, contracts signed that would generate revenue streams lasting years into the future. His partners celebrated with expensive champagne and self-congratulation, toasting his skill in navigating the complex deal structure, but Massimo felt detached from his own success. The achievement that would have once validated his entire existence now seemed hollow. Numbers on documents that meant nothing compared to the simple pleasure of watching Isla draw or listening to Marilyn hum while she worked. He extended his stay by 4 days, because the rational part of his mind insisted that consolidating the Singapore deal properly mattered more than whatever emotional entanglement waited in New York. The extension was justified by legitimate business considerations, but underneath the logic was continued avoidance of something he'd started but didn't know how to finish. His days stretched into a monotony of meetings and hotel rooms and carefully maintained distance from anything requiring genuine feeling. A package arrived at his hotel during the 4th week, forwarded by his assistant with a note explaining that it had been left at his penthouse. Massimo opened it to find a drawing from Isla, the paper carefully protected in a plastic sleeve, showing 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun. The taller figure on the left was clearly meant to be him, dark scribbles indicating hair, standing next to 2 smaller figures with yellow pigtails and blonde hair respectively. The drawing hit harder than any business setback ever had, this evidence that he'd mattered enough to a 3-year-old for her to send artwork across the world to wherever he'd disappeared to. A note in Marilyn's handwriting accompanied the picture, brief and without accusation, simply stating that Isla wanted him to have this and hoped he was well. The restraint in those words somehow made them more devastating than anger would have been. The implication that his absence had been noticed, but wouldn't be held against him. Massimo sat in his hotel room holding the drawing, aware that he'd been running from exactly the kind of connection this child offered, without conditions or expectations of return. Isla's affection didn't require him to be anything other than present, didn't demand performance or strategic value, just the simple act of showing up and participating in her world. The purity of that offering terrified him more than any business rival ever had, because accepting it meant vulnerability he'd spent decades learning to avoid. He made a decision in that moment, fingers still holding the drawing that would eventually join the framed artwork on his desk. The Singapore deal was complete enough to delegate remaining details to local attorneys, the financial structures in place, and requiring only administrative follow-through. Massimo called his assistant and instructed her to book the earliest flight back to New York, ignoring her surprise at the sudden change in plans when he'd been insisting on extended presence just days before. The return flight felt longer than the original journey, 13 hours to consider what he would say when he saw Marilyn and Isla again, how he would explain the disappearance that must have seemed like confirmation of every wealthy person's unreliability. His practiced speeches all sounded hollow in his internal rehearsal, empty words that couldn't bridge the gap between his fear and their deserved expectations. He settled finally on simple honesty, the approach he'd spent years avoiding because it required admitting to weaknesses he'd preferred to keep hidden. New York appeared below the plane wrapped in early December cold, the city he'd left nearly a month ago now feeling like home in ways Singapore's luxury never had. Massimo's driver met him at the airport, and instead of directing him to the penthouse, he gave Marilyn's Queen's address without explanation. The driver's eyebrows rose, but he entered the destination without comment, navigating toward a neighborhood that represented everything Massimo's wealth was designed to escape. The fourth-floor walk-up looked exactly as he remembered, tired brick and fire escapes and the kind of urban density that money fled from whenever possible. Massimo climbed the stairs he'd ascended once before, his expensive luggage feeling absurd in the narrow stairwell, aware that arriving without warning represented another presumption about access to their lives. He reached their door and stood there for a moment, hand raised to knock, suddenly understanding that what happened next would determine whether the connection he'd been running from could survive his fear. The knock sounded louder than he'd intended in the quiet hallway, and he heard movement inside, followed by Marilyn's voice asking who it was. When she opened the door, her expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been anger, before settling on careful neutrality. She didn't invite him in immediately, her body blocking the entrance in a way that communicated boundaries he'd violated by leaving without explanation and returning without warning. Massimo started to speak, his prepared words dissolving under her steady gaze, and what emerged was stripped of all the sophisticated deflection he usually employed. He told her he'd been afraid, that getting close to her and Isla had terrified him because everyone he'd ever cared about had eventually left through death or choice or circumstance. The admission was rawer than he'd intended. Years of defended vulnerability cracking open in the hallway of a Queen's apartment building, because this woman and her daughter had somehow become more important than his carefully maintained emotional armor. Marilyn listened without interrupting, her expression gradually softening as she heard what he wasn't saying underneath the words he managed to articulate. When he finished, she asked quietly if he was going to run again, if this pattern would repeat every time connection felt too real. The question was fair and devastating, demanding honesty about future behavior he couldn't fully predict, but Massimo understood that anything less than complete commitment would rightfully end whatever possibility existed between them. The hallway suddenly felt too small for the weight of what was being negotiated between them, years of respective damage and survival strategies colliding in a space designed only for passing through to somewhere else. Massimo could hear a television playing faintly from a neighboring apartment, someone's laughter filtering through thin walls, the ordinary sounds of other people's lives continuing while his entire future balanced on whether this woman standing in a doorway would give him a second chance he wasn't certain he deserved. Her eyes searched his face for evidence of sincerity versus performance, the kind of examination he'd faced across negotiating tables, but never with stakes that mattered beyond financial outcomes. He found himself telling her about the drawing Isla had sent to Singapore, how opening that package in his sterile hotel room had broken something in his carefully maintained defenses against caring too much about anyone. The image of 3 stick figures holding hands had forced him to confront what he'd been running from, the reality that he'd already become part of their family in his heart, even while his fear kept insisting that attachment led inevitably to loss. Massimo explained that he'd spent the return flight understanding that the pain of potential future loss was less significant than the guaranteed pain of choosing isolation over connection, that Isla's simple drawing had taught him what years of therapy and business success never could. Marilyn's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders dropping slightly from their defensive height, and Massimo recognized the physical manifestation of internal walls beginning to lower, despite justified caution. She admitted that Isla had asked about him every single day he'd been gone, that explaining his absence without knowing if he'd return had been one of the hardest parenting challenges she'd faced since her husband's death. The parallel she was drawing was clear without being accusatory. The understanding that disappearing people created trauma regardless of their intentions, that Isla's small heart couldn't distinguish between death and choice, when the result was identical absence. He promised he wouldn't run, the words feeling simultaneously like the most honest and most terrifying thing he'd ever said to another person. Marilyn studied his face for what felt like extended silence, clearly weighing whether to trust someone whose wealth and position gave him every advantage except reliability in relationships. Finally, she stepped back from the door, the gesture inviting him inside while communicating that trust would be earned rather than assumed, that this second chance came with conditions he'd need to prove he could meet. Isla looked up from her position on the floor where she'd been arranging Rosie and several other toys in elaborate configuration, her face transforming when she saw who'd entered. She scrambled to her feet and ran to him with the uncomplicated joy children displayed, before learning to guard their affection, her small arms wrapping around his legs in the hug that had become their greeting. Massimo's hand settled on her shoulder with more confidence than the first time, muscle memory developing for affection. He was still learning to accept without flinching. The child asked where he'd been with the directness adults learned to avoid, wanting to know if he'd been sick or if she'd done something wrong to make him leave. The questions revealed that Isla had been constructing explanations for his absence in the way children did when adults disappeared without explanation, taking responsibility for abandonment that had nothing to do with her behavior. Massimo knelt to her level, maintaining eye contact while explaining that he'd had to travel for work, but should have told her goodbye first, that her drawings had followed him across the world because she was important to him. Isla accepted this explanation with the resilience children showed when adults acknowledged mistakes, her attention already shifting to showing him the game she'd been playing before his arrival. Marilyn watched their interaction with an expression mixing relief and continued wariness, clearly understanding that his relationship with her daughter was separate from but connected to whatever was developing between the two adults. She offered tea with less formality than previous occasions, the gesture suggesting that his presence in her home was becoming normalized, despite the strangeness of their situation. They talked while Isla played, Massimo describing Singapore with honesty about how the isolation he'd once valued now felt like self-imposed exile from anything meaningful. Marilyn shared what the past month had been like, cleaning his empty penthouse while Isla asked questions she couldn't answer about when he was coming back. The parallel experiences of absence created unexpected intimacy, both of them having spent weeks considering what the other person's disappearance meant about their own value and vulnerability. Massimo found himself explaining his childhood in more detail than he'd ever shared with anyone, the poverty and instability, and eventual escape through intelligence and ruthlessness that had built his current life. The telling wasn't comfortable, each admission about where he'd come from feeling like exposure of weaknesses he'd spent years covering with expensive clothing and powerful connections. But Marilyn listened without judgment, occasionally interjecting with understanding that came from living adjacent to the struggles he described, her own experience with economic precarity creating framework for comprehension. She talked about her late husband in return, the relationship that had been built on shared working-class values and dreams of incremental improvement rather than dramatic wealth. His death had shattered their careful planning, leaving her with grief and debt and a daughter who would never remember her father except through stories and photographs. The loss had taught Marilyn that security was illusion regardless of preparation, that catastrophe could arrive without warning and destroy everything you'd built on foundation you'd believed was solid. The conversation stretched into evening, Isla eventually climbing onto the couch between them and falling asleep with her head on Massimo's leg, trusting weight that pinned him in place physically and emotionally. Marilyn smiled at her daughter's choice of pillow, commenting that Isla had clearly forgiven his absence with the speed children employed when adults proved they were trying. The observation carried implicit question about whether Marilyn herself was ready to extend similar forgiveness, whether trust once broken by disappearance could be restored through return and explanation. Massimo asked what she needed from him to believe he was serious about being present, rather than cycling through patterns of approach and retreat. The question gave her permission to articulate expectations rather than hoping he'd intuit them, and Marilyn considered before responding with surprising specificity. She needed consistency more than grand gestures, regular presence that proved he was choosing them, rather than filling time between more important commitments. She needed honesty when he felt overwhelmed rather than disappearance without explanation. And she needed acknowledgement that her daughter's heart was more fragile than it appeared behind resilient exterior. He agreed to her terms without negotiation, understanding that what she was offering was framework for relationship, rather than demands for compliance. The structure she described actually felt relieving after years of navigating connections that required constant strategic calculation. This simple request for honest presence refreshingly direct. Massimo found himself asking what would happen next, whether they were building towards something specific, or simply seeing where consistent presence led without predetermined destination. Marilyn admitted she didn't know, that she'd never imagined dating her wealthy employer who fixed her daughter's broken dolls and showed up at playgrounds in expensive casual wear. The word dating hung between them, neither quite accurate nor completely wrong for what was developing through cleaning schedules and shared meals and conversations that went deeper than their respective roles usually allowed. She added that whatever this was, it needed to move at pace that protected Isla from becoming attached to stability that might disappear if adult relationship didn't survive. The concern was valid and painful. The recognition that his connection with Isla existed somewhat independently from whatever was emerging between him and Marilyn. Massimo understood that the child had already attached to him in ways that would cause damage if he left again, that his responsibility to her had been created through his own choice to engage, rather than maintain professional distance. The weight of that responsibility felt heavy in ways business obligations never had, because failing at this would hurt someone innocent rather than merely costing money. They established new patterns over the following weeks, Massimo clearing his schedule in ways that confused his business associates who'd never known him to prioritize anything over work. He started joining Marilyn and Isla for dinner several times weekly, sometimes at his penthouse, but increasingly at their small apartment where the warmth came from people rather than expensive heating systems. The domesticity of these evenings felt foreign, but increasingly necessary, the simple ritual of shared meals creating foundation for connection that transcended their disparate economic realities. Isla began expecting his presence in ways that both thrilled and terrified him, her face lighting up when he arrived, and her small hand automatically reaching for his when they walked to the park on Sunday afternoons. The casual assumption of his belonging in her world challenged everything he'd believed about his capacity for family connection, this child's faith in his reliability creating pressure to become the person she believed he was. Marilyn watched these interactions with expressions that shifted between joy and fear, clearly wrestling with her own vulnerability to someone whose world gave him infinite options, while she had only this. Massimo discovered that Isla's routines created structure he'd never known he needed, her bedtime rituals and meal preferences establishing patterns that organized his days around something beyond profit margins and strategic positioning. He learned that 3-year-olds required consistency more than spontaneity, that promising to read a story meant actually reading it regardless of business calls waiting, that her trust was built through repeated small fulfillments, rather than occasional grand gestures. The discipline required was different from business discipline, demanding presence rather than performance, and he found himself valuing commitments to her above obligations that had once seemed non-negotiable. His business partners noticed the transformation without understanding its source, commenting that he seemed distracted during negotiations that would have once commanded his complete focus. What they interpreted as distraction was actually reprioritization, his mind now occupied with remembering to buy the specific crackers Isla preferred, or ensuring he'd be home for dinner rather than staying late for meetings that could happen without him. The shift created friction with associates who'd relied on his availability, but Massimo found he cared less about their inconvenience than about breaking promises to a child who checked the clock waiting for his arrival. Marilyn's apartment began to feel less like her space he was visiting, and more like shared territory, his belongings accumulating there through forgetfulness that might have been unconscious intention. A spare shirt appeared in her closet, his preferred coffee in her cabinet, his reading glasses on her nightstand, each item marking incremental claiming of domestic space he'd never imagined inhabiting. She teased him about the gradual invasion, but her tone carried warmth that suggested she welcomed evidence of his integration into their daily existence, that his presence was becoming assumed rather than negotiated. The financial disparity between them created tensions neither had fully anticipated. Moments when his casual spending on things they needed highlighted the gulf between his resources and her limitations. Massimo tried to navigate this carefully, offering to cover expenses without making Marilyn feel like a dependent. But the dynamics of money and power were difficult to disentangle from genuine care. She insisted on contributing what she could to shared meals and activities, her pride requiring participation, even when the mathematics made her contributions functionally symbolic. And he learned to accept her need for financial agency, even when it seemed inefficient by purely economic calculation. December brought holidays that Massimo had previously ignored as commercial interruptions to business operations, but Isla's excitement about Christmas made avoidance impossible. She drew pictures of Santa and reindeer, explained the complex logistics of toy delivery with the serious conviction children brought to mythology they hadn't yet learned to question, and asked what he wanted for Christmas with genuine concern for his wishes. The question revealed that she'd been thinking about what would make him happy, that he occupied space in her considerations beyond what he could provide. He found himself shopping for gifts with an attention to detail usually reserved for contract negotiations, trying to find presents that would delight without overwhelming, that showed he understood who Isla was rather than throwing money at uncertainty. The toy store confused him initially with its overwhelming options, but he eventually selected items that reflected what he'd learned about her preferences, art supplies and books, and a stuffed animal that reminded him of Rosie's gentle expression. Shopping for Marilyn proved more complex. The potential implications of gift-giving between adults requiring navigation of signals, he wasn't certain he was reading correctly. Christmas Eve found him at their apartment. With gifts wrapped in paper Isla had helped him select, her artistic input resulting in choices that coordinated nothing but pleased her aesthetic sensibilities. They exchanged presents in the living room while snow fell outside windows, and Isla's reaction to each opened gift justified every moment he'd spent considering what would bring her joy. But it was Marilyn's response to the sketchbook and professional colored pencils he'd chosen that hit hardest, her tears suggesting the gift acknowledged dreams she'd stopped admitting she still held. She'd mentioned once in passing that she'd wanted to study design before circumstances had required choosing immediate income over education, a detail he'd remembered and used to select supplies for the creative work she'd abandoned. The sketchbook was expensive, but not ostentatiously so, quality that would support serious work without feeling like charity disguised as gift-giving. Marilyn held it like it was precious, her fingers tracing the leather cover while she tried to compose herself enough to thank him without crying more obviously. Isla announced that now her mommy could draw with her, that they could make pictures together. The observation delivered with the delight of someone who'd just discovered shared interest with a beloved person. The moment crystallized something for Massimo, watching mother and daughter discuss their future art projects, understanding that what he wanted was to be part of these small moments of joy, indefinitely. The recognition came with clarity that eliminated the ambiguity he'd been navigating, replacing uncertainty with decision that felt simultaneously terrifying and absolutely correct. January arrived with New York wrapped in cold that made Marilyn's building feel even more drafty than usual, the old radiators fighting losing battle against winter's intrusion. Massimo found himself spending more nights on their couch than in his penthouse, the excuse of late evenings making return to Manhattan impractical, becoming less excuse and more preference. Isla had begun asking when he was staying versus leaving, her 3-year-old brain trying to establish pattern from his irregular presence, and the question made him realize that ambiguity was causing exactly the confusion Marilyn had warned against. He started looking at houses in mid-January, a search that would have seemed insane months ago, but now felt like logical next step in trajectory he could no longer pretend was temporary. The real estate agent showed him properties in Westchester and Connecticut, suburban locations that would provide space for family he was planning without having explicitly discussed the plan. Each house felt wrong for different reasons, until he saw a place in a town that split the difference between Manhattan and Queens, close enough for Marilyn to maintain her client connections, while offering yard and stability Isla deserved. The house was modest by his financial standards, but enormous by Marilyn's. 3 bedrooms and a kitchen that opened to living space designed for family interaction, rather than isolated efficiency. It had a backyard with old trees that would provide shade in summer, a front porch that suggested evening sitting and neighborhood interaction, everything about it representing lifestyle he'd never imagined choosing. Massimo made an offer the same day he saw it, the decision requiring none of the careful analysis he usually applied to financial commitments. He told Marilyn about the house on a Tuesday evening, while Isla was occupied with coloring at the kitchen table, his explanation stumbling through details about bedrooms and backyards before arriving at the actual question underneath the information. He wanted them to live there with him, wanted to build life together in space that wasn't his penthouse or her struggling apartment, but something new they could all inhabit. The proposal wasn't quite marriage offer, but implied commitment that went beyond dating his housekeeper while maintaining separate residences. Marilyn's response wasn't the immediate acceptance part of him had hoped for, her expression cycling through emotions too complex to name individually before landing on something between longing and terror. She asked what he was really asking, whether this was about helping her financially or building actual family, whether he understood the difference and which one he was offering. The questions were fair and cut through any romantic ambiguity to practical realities that would determine whether this arrangement succeeded or created disaster more painful than their current uncertainty. Massimo found himself on his knees beside her chair, not quite proposing but not proposing either, his hands taking hers while he tried to articulate feelings that business vocabulary had never prepared him to express. He told her he loved her, the words emerging rough and unpracticed but undeniably honest, that he loved Isla in ways that terrified him because children were hostages to fortune, and loving them meant accepting vulnerability to loss. He wanted to marry her if she'd have him, wanted to be Isla's father in every way that mattered, wanted to build the family he'd never believed he was capable of having. Marilyn cried, which he'd expected, but she also laughed through the tears in ways he hadn't anticipated, the combination suggesting emotions too large for single response. She said yes, the word simple and definitive, then added that he was completely insane if he thought any of this made sense given their different worlds. But sense apparently wasn't requirement for commitment, and she'd learned through losing her first husband that security was illusion anyway, so she might as well choose love over sensible caution if love was what he was offering. Isla looked up from her coloring to ask why her mommy was crying, and when Marilyn explained that Massimo had asked them to live with him in a new house, the child's response was immediate and enthusiastic. She wanted to know if she could bring Rosie and all her drawings, whether there would be space for her toys, and if maybe they could get a dog since houses had yards. Her practical concerns about logistics made the entire situation feel more real than the emotional declarations had. This child's matter-of-fact acceptance that her family was expanding to include the man who'd fixed her doll. The engagement happened officially 2 days later, when Massimo presented Marilyn with a ring he'd chosen without the assistance of jewelers who would have steered him toward ostentatious displays of wealth. The stone was modest and the setting simple, selected because it reminded him of her practical beauty rather than because it would impress anyone else. She cried again when he slipped it on her finger, the band fitting perfectly because he'd somehow guessed her size correctly, and Isla announced that now they were all going to live together like real families did. They moved into the house in late February, the process complicated by combining his minimalist possessions with their modest belongings into space that suddenly felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived. Isla's drawings went up on the refrigerator and walls, her artistic documentation of their evolving family covering surfaces that had been blank before. Marilyn set up her sketchbook and supplies on a desk in the corner of the living room, her creative work slowly resuming in stolen hours after Isla went to bed. The neighborhood welcomed them with curiosity that bordered on suspicion, their story not quite fitting the typical suburban narrative of gradually accumulating families. Massimo's obvious wealth created questions from neighbors who wondered what brought someone with his resources to their modest street, whether he was running from something or simply eccentric in his housing choices. Marilyn navigated these social dynamics with grace he lacked, her working-class authenticity providing credibility that his expensive casual wear undermined, explaining their situation as simply as love, without elaborating on the unconventional path that had brought them here. Isla adapted to the new house with the resilience children showed when their primary attachments remained stable, claiming the smallest bedroom as her domain, and decorating it with the systematic intention of someone establishing territory. She insisted on specific placement for Rosie on her shelf, arranged her crayons by color in containers Massimo had purchased, and created gallery walls with her artwork that transformed blank space into documentation of her interior world. The room became reflection of her personality in ways the apartment had never allowed, space itself communicating that she was valued enough to have domain of her own. Marilyn's transition proved more complex than Isla's, her discomfort with the house's size and amenities revealing how thoroughly she'd internalized limitations as identity rather than circumstance. She moved through rooms apologizing for touching things, as if expensive countertops and quality appliances were museum pieces rather than tools for daily living, and Massimo had to repeatedly remind her that this was her home now, that nothing here was too precious for actual use. The psychological adjustment from scarcity to sufficiency required time, her instincts still calibrated to conserve and make do even when conservation was no longer necessary for survival. Financial conversations became unavoidable as they merged lives, Massimo wanting to eliminate her debt and establish accounts that would provide security she'd never known, while Marilyn resisted changes that felt like losing independence she'd fought to maintain through impossible circumstances. They compromised eventually on structures that protected her autonomy, while acknowledging the practical reality that his resources could remove obstacles that had constrained her choices. She agreed to let him pay off her late husband's medical debt on condition that she would contribute equally to household expenses from her growing design income, the negotiation revealing that dignity mattered more to her than optimization mattered to him. The wedding happened in April at the courthouse with Isla as their witness. No elaborate ceremony because what mattered was commitment rather than performance for others. Isla wore a yellow dress that matched her pigtails and carried Rosie as if the doll were essential participant in the proceedings, and when the judge pronounced them married, the child clapped with such enthusiasm that everyone in the courthouse office smiled. Massimo felt something unlock in his chest during that moment. Years of defensive isolation crumbling completely as he accepted that this small family was now his responsibility and privilege. Life developed rhythms that would have seemed impossible in his previous existence. Isla's preschool schedule, and Marilyn's part-time design work that she'd resumed, and his own business operations that he'd learned to contain rather than allow to consume everything. Sunday mornings became pancake tradition, and Massimo discovered that burned edges and irregular shapes somehow tasted better when Isla helped make them. Bedtime stories became his domain, and he found himself inventing elaborate narratives to accompany the picture books that lined Isla's shelves. The penthouse sold to a tech executive who wanted exactly the kind of isolated luxury Massimo had once valued, and he felt nothing but relief watching that chapter close. The house filled with sounds that expensive silence had never provided. Isla's laughter and Marilyn's humming and the general noise of people living together in genuine connection. His business associates adjusted to his new boundaries around work hours, and the ones who couldn't accept that family took priority gradually fell away, revealing which relationships had been transactional all along. Rosie remained Isla's constant companion, the doll's visible scars across her porcelain face a reminder of how broken things could be restored with patience and care. The fracture lines never faded, but Isla seemed to love the doll more because of them, not despite them. Her acceptance of imperfection teaching lessons Massimo was still learning to apply to himself. He'd framed the drawing she'd made after the repair, the one showing the three of them together, and it hung in his study alongside the contracts and documents that had once been the only evidence of his existence mattering. One evening in June, when Isla had been asleep for hours, and Marilyn sat beside him sketching while he reviewed contracts, Massimo looked around at the life they'd built from the fragments of a broken doll and a crying child. His journey from isolation to family hadn't followed any path he'd have predicted, and certainly didn't make sense by the logic that had governed his previous existence. But watching his wife create art while their daughter slept upstairs in a house that smelled of dinner they'd cooked together, Massimo understood that sometimes the most important repairs happened to things you didn't realize were broken until someone showed you what wholeness could look like. The transformation from Mafia boss, who heard a child crying, to father who kissed goodbyes before leaving for work, had happened gradually through accumulation of small moments, rather than dramatic revelation. Each choice to stay rather than leave, to engage rather than retreat, to risk vulnerability rather than maintain safety, had built foundation for family that now felt inevitable, despite having been entirely unexpected. Massimo had learned that the cracks where things had broken and been mended often became the strongest parts, that visible scars could mark healing rather than damage, and that sometimes the best things in life came from being willing to fix what seemed irreparably shattered. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing you stories about broken things becoming beautiful, about second chances and unexpected families, about love that heals even the deepest wounds. Remember that sometimes the cracks are what let the light in, and the most precious connections often begin with the simplest acts of kindness.